I'm Bryn Hollingsworth, 48, and I built the city's most successful real estate empire from a single rundown apartment in the worst neighborhood in Chicago. I stood on the polished teak deck of the gilded cage, my hands gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. The Pacific Ocean stretched out endlessly before us, a vast canvas of deep indigo and terrifying silence. The sun was setting, casting a blood-orange glare across the water, but I couldn't appreciate the view. My entire focus was locked on the man lounging in the white leather captain's chair across from me. Julian, my son-in-law. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, the ice clinking with a sound that grated against my nerves like sandpaper. He was on his fifth scotch of the afternoon. His eyes, usually a charming hazel that had fooled my daughter 2 years ago, were now glassy and dark with a predatory malice. He looked at my daughter, Macy, who sat huddled on a bench seat near the stern. Macy was 6 months pregnant, her hands protectively cradling the swell of her belly. She looked small. She looked terrified. The wind whipped her hair across her face, sticking to the tears that were already drying on her cheeks. "You're pathetic, you know that." Julian slurred, his voice dripping with venom. I felt a spike of adrenaline shoot through my chest, a familiar heat that I hadn't felt since my days fighting contractors in muddy construction sites. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "That is enough." He didn't even look at me. He just took another long, slow sip of his drink, savoring the burn. "Oh, look who's talking," he sneered, finally turning his gaze toward me. "The landlord. Tell me, Bryn, how much did this boat cost you?" 3 million, 4. It was a wedding gift, I replied, my voice steady despite the rage boiling in my gut. "For Macy, not for you to use as a floating dive bar." He laughed, a harsh barking sound that was swallowed by the ocean breeze. "Everything is for Macy," he mocked, standing up and swaying slightly with the motion of the waves. "Macy gets the houses, Macy gets the cars, Macy gets the yacht." He took a stumbling step toward her. Macy flinched. My body went rigid. I calculated the distance between us. 10 feet. I was wearing heels, but I had taken them off 10 minutes ago, sensing the mood shifting. I stood barefoot on the wood, my toes gripping the deck for stability. "And what do I get?" Julian shouted, throwing his arms wide, sloshing scotch onto the pristine white cushions. "I get a fat wife who can't even pour me a drink without shaking." "Stop it, Julian," Macy whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, you're scaring the baby." "The baby," he spat the words out like they tasted rotten. "That's all you talk about, the precious heir to the Hollingsworth fortune." He loomed over her, blocking the dying sunlight. "You think you're so special because you're carrying it? You're just the vessel, Macy. A vessel that's getting wider and uglier by the day." I moved. I didn't think about it, I just placed myself between him and my daughter. I am not a tall woman, but I have stared down union bosses and hostile takeover sharks who thought they could eat me alive. I looked up into Julian's face, smelling the sour reek of alcohol and entitlement on his breath. "Sit down, Julian," I commanded, projecting the authority that had closed billion-dollar deals. "You are drunk. You are abusive, and we are turning this boat around right now." He looked down at me, blinking as if he couldn't believe I was speaking to him. For a second, I saw hesitation in his eyes. But then his ego took over. He was a man who had never been told no, a man who had married into money and resented every single cent of it because he hadn't earned it himself. "This is my boat," he growled, poking a finger into my shoulder. I didn't flinch. "Technically," I said, my voice ice cold, "it's in a trust, which I control." That was the wrong thing to say. I saw the snap happen in real time. His face contorted, twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He wasn't just a drunk son-in-law anymore, he was a threat. "You think you control everything," he hissed, leaning in close to my face. "You and your pathetic little empire, you think money makes you safe?" My heart hammered against my ribs, not out of fear for myself, but for the realization of how isolated we were. We were 20 miles offshore. The crew had been dismissed to the lower decks by Julian an hour ago so he could have privacy. It was just us and the ocean. "I think money gives me options," I said, refusing to back down. "And right now my option is to cut you off, completely. The cards, the accounts, the access, it's gone, Julian, as of this moment." The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air. Macy let out a small sob behind me. Julian's expression went blank. It was the kind of calm that comes before a hurricane rips the roof off a house. He set his glass down on the railing with deliberate slowness. "You want to cut me off?" he asked softly. He looked past me directly at Macy. "You want to take everything away?" "I am protecting my family," I stated, bracing my legs as the yacht hit a swell. "Family," he laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "You don't know the first thing about family, Bryn, you just know leverage." He took a step back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Well, I've got some leverage too." I didn't like the look in his eyes. It was manic, it was dangerous. He looked at the dark, churning water below the railing, then back at Macy. "Julian, don't do anything stupid," I warned, my instincts screaming that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Stupid," he grinned, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "No, Bryn, I'm just leveling the playing field." He lunged. But he didn't lunge at me. He sidestepped me with a speed I didn't think he possessed in his intoxicated state. He went straight for Macy. "No," I screamed, turning to grab him, but I was a fraction of a second too slow. He grabbed Macy by the arm, hauling her up from the bench with brutal force. She screamed, clutching her belly with her free hand. "You want to control the trust?" Julian roared, dragging her toward the open railing where the safety gate had been unlatched for swimming earlier. "Let's see how much control you have over gravity." My blood turned to ice. He wasn't just trying to scare us, he was going to kill her. I scrambled across the deck, my fingernails digging into his linen shirt, trying to anchor him, trying to stop the momentum. "Let her go," I shrieked, clawing at his face. He backhanded me without even looking, a heavy blow that sent me sprawling onto the hard teak. My head cracked against the deck, stars exploding in my vision. Through the dizzying haze, I saw it happen. I saw him shove her. I saw my pregnant daughter, the love of my life, the future of my legacy, stumble backward. She reached out, her fingers grasping for purchase on the smooth fiberglass, but there was nothing to hold. Her eyes met mine for one horrifying split second, wide, pleading, and full of absolute betrayal. Then she tipped backward, and she was gone. The splash was sickeningly loud in the silence. "Macy!" I screamed, the sound tearing my throat apart. I scrambled to the edge, looking down into the dark, swirling water. Julian stood there, panting, his chest heaving, a sick look of triumph on his face. He looked at me, then down at the water where Macy was struggling to surface. "Oops," he whispered. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea that while I was the money, I wasn't the muscle. He had no idea that my brother wasn't just some uncle who sent birthday cards. He didn't know that my brother was a legend in the kind of circles Julian only saw in movies. But as I watched my daughter fight for her life in the wake of the yacht, I knew one thing for certain. Julian was going to wish he had drowned himself. I'm Bryn Hollingsworth, 54 years old, and while I built a commercial real estate empire that dominates the West Coast skyline, my greatest accomplishment was supposed to be keeping my family safe. The air on the aft deck was so thick with tension it felt like breathing through wet wool. I stood barefoot on the teak decking, every muscle in my calves coiled tight, watching the man my daughter loved transform into a stranger. Julian was pacing now, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, the crystal tumbler in his hand splashing amber scotch onto the pristine white cushions. He looked wild, his hair disheveled by the ocean wind, his face flushed with a dangerous cocktail of alcohol and resentment. Macy sat frozen on the bench seat, her hands shielding her pregnant belly, as if her fingers alone could protect the life growing inside her from the venom spilling out of her husband's mouth. She looked so small against the vast, darkening backdrop of the Pacific, her eyes wide and brimming with a terror that broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You don't get it, do you?" Julian shouted, spinning around to face her, his voice cracking with a hysterical edge. "You think this," he gestured violently at her stomach, then at the yacht, then at the horizon, "is enough. You think trapping me in this domestic prison is a life." "Julian, please," Macy whispered, her voice trembling so hard it was barely audible over the hum of the engines and the slap of water against the hull. "We're a family. We're having a baby." "A baby?" Julian threw his head back and let out a laugh that sounded like glass shattering. "No, Macy, it's not a baby. It's a ball and chain." He took a step closer to her, looming over her shrinking form. I stepped forward, my instincts screaming, but he ignored me, his eyes locked on Macy with a predatory intensity. "You used to be fun," he sneered, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "You used to be the life of the party, now look at you, swollen, tired, boring." "That is enough," I barked, my voice projecting the command voice I used to silence boardrooms. I moved to intercept him, to put my body between his rage and my daughter. But Julian was faster than I anticipated. He whipped around, his eyes glassy and vacant of any humanity. "She's an anchor," he screamed, the words tearing out of his throat. "She's a goddamn anchor dragging my social life down to the bottom of the ocean, and I am done drowning for her." The violence happened in a blur, yet my mind recorded it in agonizing slow motion. Julian didn't just yell, he moved. "No." I shrieked, lunging forward, but I was too far away. Julian grabbed Macy's upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with bruising force. She cried out, a sharp, confused sound, trying to pull away, but he was fueled by a manic, drunken strength. He didn't pull her toward safety, he shoved her. He shoved her hard. He shoved her directly toward the low stern railing where the safety gate had been unlatched for our afternoon swim. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, skipping a beat as I saw the impossible happen. Macy stumbled backward, her center of gravity thrown off by the pregnancy. Her heels skidded on the damp wood. She reached out, her fingers clawing at the air, grasping for a handhold that wasn't there. For one horrific second our eyes met. I saw the confusion in hers, the betrayal, the absolute paralyzing fear. And then I saw her heels lift off the deck. "Macy." I screamed, the name ripping through my throat, raw and burning. She tipped backward over the edge. There was no splash at first, just the sickening sight of her disappearing into the void beyond the railing. Then, a second later, came the sound, a heavy, muffled impact against the water that sounded nothing like a dive and everything like a body hitting a concrete wall. "Macy." I scrambled across the deck, my knees slamming into the hard wood as I threw myself against the railing, looking down into the abyss. The wake of the yacht was a churning mess of white foam and black water. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the ocean a terrifying, inky darkness. "Where is she?" I gasped, scanning the turbulent water, my vision blurring with panic. "Macy, swim." I saw a flash of pale fabric in the foam. A hand broke the surface, thrashing wildly. "Help her!" I screamed, turning back to Julian. "Get the life ring, Julian, help her!" But Julian wasn't moving. He was standing by the captain's intercom, one hand resting casually on the controls, looking at me with a detached, eerie calm. He didn't even look over the side. He didn't look at the woman carrying his child struggling in the freezing water. He just laughed. It was a low, dry chuckle that made my blood run cold. "Anchor away," he muttered, swaying slightly. Then he leaned into the intercom, pressing the talk button. "Captain," Julian said, his voice surprisingly steady. "We're done here. Let's head back to the marina." I froze, my hands gripping the cold metal of the railing. "What are you doing?" "Full throttle," Julian commanded into the mic. "I want to be back before the bars close." "No," I screamed, turning back to the water. The engines roared to life beneath my feet, a deep, vibrating thrum that signaled a surge of power. The yacht lurched forward, the bow lifting as the propellers bit into the water. "Stop!" I yelled, waving my arms at the bridge, but the tinted glass hid the captain from view. He couldn't hear me over the roar of the engines and the wind. He was following orders. I watched in horror as the distance between us and the spot where Macy fell began to grow rapidly. The white foam of the wake intensified, churning violently, creating a wall of water that would make it impossible for her to keep her head above the surface. "Julian, stop the boat." I lunged at him, grabbing his shirt, shaking him with every ounce of strength I had. "You're killing her, turn it around." He shoved me off easily, brushing his shirt as if I were a speck of dust. "She wanted to be independent," he slurred, turning his back on me to pour another drink. "Let her swim." I scrambled back to the stern, leaning as far over as I dared. The darkness was swallowing everything. The white froth of the wake stretched out behind us like a scar on the ocean, widening with every second. I couldn't see her anymore. I couldn't see the pale fabric of her dress. I couldn't see her hand. She was gone. Left behind in the freezing, shark-infested waters of the Pacific, 20 miles from shore, by the man who had vowed to protect her. I sank to my knees on the deck, the vibration of the full-throttle engines rattling my bones. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drunken mistake. This was an execution. I looked at Julian's back as he stared at the horizon, sipping his scotch. He thought he had won. He thought he had just cut loose the anchor and secured his access to the Hollingsworth fortune without the baggage. My breathing hitched, turning into a ragged sob, but beneath the grief something else was igniting. A cold, hard resolve that was older and deeper than my business empire. Julian didn't know. He didn't know that my brother, the man Macy called Uncle Red, wasn't just a retired mechanic living in a cabin. He didn't know that the only reason Red wasn't at the wedding was because he was on a black ops rotation that didn't exist on paper. He didn't realize that by throwing my daughter into the ocean, he hadn't just committed a crime. He had signed his own death warrant. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the risks. I didn't consider the fact that I was 54 years old, wearing a silk blouse and linen trousers, or that the water below was a freezing, churning death trap. I just watched the distance between the yacht and my drowning daughter grow, and my body made the decision before my brain could catch up. I grabbed the hard plastic life ring mounted on the stern railing, ripped it from its bracket with a strength I didn't know I possessed, and hurled it into the blackness. Then, I vaulted the rail. For a split second, I was suspended in the cool night air, the smell of diesel exhaust and salt filling my nose. Then the ocean rushed up to meet me. The impact was brutal. It felt less like entering water and more like slamming into a brick wall at 40 miles per hour. The cold was instantaneous and paralyzing. It punched the air right out of my lungs, seizing my chest in a vice grip of icy shock. I went deep, the momentum dragging me down into the inky void, tumbling me end over end like a rag doll. My eyes were open, stinging violently from the salt, but I could see nothing but swirling darkness and the terrifying white turbulence of the yacht's wake above me. A roar filled my ears, a deep mechanical thrumming that vibrated through my very teeth. The propellers. Panic flared in my gut, hot and sharp. The yacht was accelerating. The suction from those massive props was a physical force, a giant hand trying to drag me backward, trying to pull me into the blades that would shred me into nothingness. I kicked. I kicked with everything I had, my legs scissoring frantically against the heavy drag of my trousers. My lungs were screaming for air, burning as if I had swallowed fire. I clawed at the water, fighting the current, fighting the suction, fighting the urge to open my mouth and gasp. I broke the surface with a ragged, desperate heave. "Macy!" I screamed, but the sound was strangled, choked off by a mouthful of seawater that tasted of oil and fear. I coughed, hacking violently, treading water as a massive swell lifted me up. I spun in a circle, wiping the stinging water from my eyes. "Macy!" I shrieked again, my voice raw. "Answer me!" The ocean was a chaotic mess of black peaks and white foam. The yacht was already 100 yards away, its stern lights shrinking into indifferent pinpricks against the horizon. The roar of the engines was fading, replaced by the terrifying, rhythmic crashing of the waves. I was alone. No, I wasn't alone. "Mom," the voice was faint, barely a whisper over the wind, but it locked onto my heart like a radar signal. I spun to my left. There, 30 yards away, a patch of white fabric bobbed in the dark water. It was her dress. She was thrashing, her movements weak and uncoordinated. "I'm coming," I yelled, spitting out water. "Kick, Macy, keep your head up." I started to swim. I used to swim laps every morning at the club, a leisurely mile to keep fit, but this was different. This was war. My clothes felt like lead weights strapped to my limbs. The cold was seeping into my muscles, making every stroke feel sluggish and heavy. My shoulders burned with a fiery lactic acid buildup, but I forced my arms to rotate. Reach, pull, kick, reach, pull, kick. Every time a swell rose up, I lost sight of her, and terror would spike in my chest, sharp and agonizing. "Don't you dare sink," I begged silently, my mind projecting the thought across the waves. "Don't you dare leave me here." I closed the distance, my breath coming in jagged, painful gasps. 10 yards, 5 yards. I could hear her now. She was making a terrible, gurgling sound, panic overriding her ability to swim. She was vertical in the water, the worst position to be in, her heavy dress and the weight of the pregnancy dragging her down. "Macy!" I lunged forward on a swell. Her head slipped beneath the surface. "No!" I dove. I forced my stinging eyes open in the murky blackness. I saw the white blur of her dress drifting downward. I kicked hard, propelling myself down, my hand stretching out until my fingers brushed fabric. I missed. I kicked again, screaming internally, and grabbed a fistful of whatever I could find. Hair. I had her hair. I yanked upward with a savage, adrenaline-fueled strength, kicking for the surface. We broke the water together, gasping. Macy was flailing, her arms striking out blindly, her survival instinct turning her into a danger to us both. "It's me," I shouted, grabbing her shoulder and shaking her. "Macy, it's Mom, stop fighting." She choked, her eyes wide and rolling, white rims flashing in the moonlight. I can't," she sputtered, water spilling from her lips. "I've got you," I promised, treading water hard to keep us both up. "I have got you." I scanned the dark water frantically. Where was the ring? I had thrown it. I knew I had thrown it. The waves lifted us again, and I saw it, a bright orange circle dancing on the crest of a wave about 20 feet away. Hold on to me, I commanded, hooking my arm under her armpit, executing a lifeguard carry I hadn't used since I was a camp counselor in the 80s. We have to move, now. She was dead weight, limp and freezing, her skin ice cold against mine. I towed her, my legs burning, my chest feeling like it was caved in. Every stroke was a battle against the ocean's indifference. We reached the ring. I grabbed the rope lining with a shaking hand, relief washing over me so intensely I almost sobbed. Grab it, I wheezed, guiding Macy's hand to the plastic. Put your arms through, now. She fumbled, her movements slow and clumsy, but she managed to hook her elbows over the side of the ring. I didn't climb on, I couldn't risk tipping it. I just held onto the side, letting my legs dangle into the abyss beneath us, gasping for air that felt too thin to sustain me. Mom, Macy whispered, her teeth chattering so hard it sounded like pebbles rattling in a jar. He left us. I looked up. In the distance, the lights of Julian's yacht were nothing more than a fading smudge against the starless sky. He hadn't turned back. He hadn't slowed down. The silence of the ocean settled around us, vast and terrifying, broken only by the slap of water against the plastic ring and Macy's ragged breathing. I squeezed her hand, my fingers numb but my grip ironclad. Yes, I said, my voice low and steady, vibrating with a cold fury that warmed me more than the sun ever could. He left us. I looked at the horizon where he had vanished. He thinks we're dead, I whispered to the waves. I pulled Macy closer, feeling the faint flutter of life from the baby inside her, a tiny spark in the middle of this freezing hell. Julian had made a fatal calculation. He thought he was the shark in these waters. He had forgotten that sharks aren't the only things that hunt in the deep. Breathe, Macy, I said, watching the last glimmer of the yacht disappear completely. Just breathe, Uncle Red is going to fix this. I'm Diane Sterling, 54, and I built a logistics dynasty from a single rusted warehouse into a global shipping empire by never letting an enemy see me bleed. 2 hours in the North Atlantic is enough time to rethink your entire life. It is enough time to feel your blood turn to slush. It is enough time to watch your only child fade from a vibrant young woman into a pale, shivering ghost. The darkness was absolute. We drifted in a void that felt less like water and more like liquid nitrogen. My legs were numb. I couldn't feel my feet anymore, and the sensation of cold had been replaced by a terrifying, dull burning. I had wrapped my legs around Macy's waist beneath the surface, trying to transfer whatever meager body heat I had left into her core. She was slipping away. Her head lolled against the hard orange plastic of the life ring, her eyes fluttering shut. Stay with me, I chattered, my jaw spasming so hard I bit my tongue. Macy, open your eyes. So tired, she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred. Warm, getting warm now. Panic spiked in my chest, sharper than the salt spray. That was the paradox of hypothermia. Right before you die, you stop feeling cold, you feel safe. No, I growled, shaking the ring violently. You are cold, Macy. You are freezing. Feel it, hate it. My hand brushed against a canister zip tied to the side of the life ring. I had been too panicked to check earlier. I fumbled with it, my fingers stiff and useless like frozen sausages. I clawed at the plastic casing, ripping a fingernail back to the quick, but I didn't feel the pain. I just felt the snap of the seal. I yanked the cord. A hiss cut through the silence. Red light exploded into the night, blinding and brilliant. The flare sputtered, bathing us in a crimson glow that made the ocean look like a sea of blood. I held it high, my arms screaming in protest. Look at the light, Macy, I commanded. Look at it. 10 minutes later, I heard the engine. It wasn't the smooth purr of a yacht. It was the aggressive growl of a twin outboard patrol boat. A spotlight swept across the waves, hitting us with the force of a physical blow. Contact, someone shouted over a loudspeaker. Port side, 2 survivors in the water. The hands that hauled me onto the deck were rough and urgent. I collapsed onto the non-slip metal flooring, coughing up seawater, my body convulsing in uncontrollable shivers. They tried to wrap a thermal blanket around me. I fought them off. Check her, I wheezed, pointing a trembling finger at Macy, who lay motionless a few feet away. She's pregnant. Check the baby. The ride to the shore was a blur of siren wails and the radio crackle of the Coast Guard coordinating an ambulance. I didn't pass out. I wouldn't allow myself the luxury of unconsciousness. I stared at the roof of the boat, my mind sharpening into a diamond-hard point. Julian had left us to drift. He had left his unborn child to freeze. The ambulance was waiting at the dock, its lights flashing against the quiet marina buildings. They loaded Macy first. I climbed in after her, dripping onto the floor, refusing the paramedic who tried to assess my vitals. Drive, I snapped, my voice raspy from the salt. The hospital was a sensory overload of bright fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. They wheeled Macy through the sliding glass doors, shouting medical jargon that made my stomach turn. Fetal heart rate is dropping. Get ob down here stat, possible placental abruption. Prep or 3, they pushed the gurney through a set of double doors. I tried to follow, but a nurse blocked my path, her face sympathetic but firm. You can't go in there, ma'am, she said gently. Let them work. I stood in the hallway alone. I was soaked to the bone. My silk blouse was ruined, clinging to my skin. My linen trousers were heavy with water pooling onto the linoleum floor. I was shivering violently, my hair plastered to my skull, looking like a drowned rat, but I stood tall. I hugged my arms around my chest, staring at the doors where my daughter had disappeared. Then I heard the click of dress shoes on the tile. It was a rhythm I knew well. It was the sound of expensive leather soles moving with arrogant purpose. I turned slowly. 3 men were walking down the corridor toward me. They were dry. They were wearing charcoal suits that cost more than the nurses made in a year. They carried sleek leather briefcases. I recognized the man in the center. Marcus Thorne, Julian's family fixer. The kind of lawyer who didn't defend clients in court, but buried their problems in shallow graves of paperwork before charges were even filed. He stopped 3 feet away from me, his nose wrinkling slightly at the smell of ocean water and diesel that radiated off me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask about Macy. He signaled to the junior associate on his left, who snapped open a briefcase and produced a thick document and a pen. Diane, Marcus said, his voice smooth and devoid of humanity. A tragic evening, truly. I stared at him, water dripping from my nose. Julian is distraught, Marcus continued, lying with the ease of a sociopath. He's in shock. He told us about Macy's accident, how she slipped near the railing, how you in your motherly panic jumped in after her before the crew could stop you. My blood ran cold, colder than the ocean had been. He said he circled back for an hour, Marcus said, his eyes locking onto mine. But the visibility, well, he thought he lost you both. He never turned around, I whispered. Marcus smiled, a tight, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. That's a matter of perspective, Diane. Trauma plays tricks on the memory. The junior associate stepped forward, holding out the document. This is a standard non-disclosure agreement, Marcus said, gesturing to the paper. and a settlement offer $10 million for your pain and suffering for the emotional distress of this unfortunate accident." He paused, letting the number hang in the air. "It also stipulates that you agree to the official narrative, that Macy fell, that it was an accident, and that you will make no public statements to the contrary." I looked at the pen. I looked at the $10 million offer. I looked at the doors where doctors were currently cutting my daughter open to save her life. Julian wasn't just covering his tracks, he was buying my silence while I was still wet. He thought I was a desperate mother. He thought I was a broken woman shivering in a hospital hallway. He thought $10 million was a lot of money. I stopped shivering. A strange calm washed over me. I looked Marcus dead in the eye. "You brought a contract to a hospital," I said, my voice low and steady. "We like to be proactive," Marcus replied. I took the document from the associate's hand. I didn't read it. I slowly, deliberately crumpled the thick paper into a tight, sodden ball in my fist. Water squeezed out of it, dripping onto Marcus's polished shoe. "Tell Julian," I said, stepping into Marcus's personal space, forcing him to smell the brine and the rage on me, "that he should have checked who my brother was before he tried to kill my family." Marcus blinked, confused. "Your brother, the mechanic." I dropped the wet ball of paper at his feet. "Keep your money, Marcus," I said. "You're going to need it for the funeral." "Whose funeral?" he asked, his composure cracking just a fraction. I didn't answer. I turned my back on them and walked toward the payphone on the wall. I had one call to make. It was time to wake up the legend. I walked away from Marcus Thorne and his charcoal-suited vultures without looking back. I could hear the squeak of their expensive shoes shifting on the linoleum, uncertain for the first time in their miserable, litigious lives. They were used to people begging. They were used to people negotiating. They were not used to a 54-year-old grandmother to be telling them to save their money for a funeral. I turned the corner, out of their sightline, and collapsed against the cool tiled wall of the corridor. My legs finally gave out. I slid down until I hit the floor, leaving a wet smear on the wall behind me. I wasn't crying. I didn't have any tears left. I just had a cold, hard knot of hatred in my chest where my heart used to be. I reached into the pocket of my sodden linen trousers. My fingers brushed against the small, yellow waterproof pouch I always kept clipped to my belt loop when I was on the water. It was a habit from the early days. Back when I was moving freight on rusted trawlers, you learned to keep two things dry: your passport and your backup plan. I unclipped the pouch with trembling fingers. My hands were still shaking from the hypothermia, making the simple latch feel like a complex puzzle. I ripped it open. Inside, nestled in the dry air of the pouch, was a black burner phone. It was old. It was a brick of a device, no touchscreen, no internet, just buttons and a battery that lasted a decade. I hadn't turned it on in 15 years. Not since the day my brother Silas walked out of my life and into the shadows. I held the power button. The screen flickered to life, glowing with a sickly green light. Battery 18%. Enough. I didn't need to look up the number. It was burned into my memory, a sequence of digits I had prayed I would never have to use. I punched them in. My thumb hovered over the call button. I knew what doing this meant. I knew that once I pressed this button, there was no going back. I wasn't just calling a family member. I was unchaining a monster. I thought about Macy. I thought about her pale face bobbing in the black water. I thought about the baby inside her, fighting for a heartbeat on a monitor in the next room. I thought about Julian sipping scotch on his yacht, thinking he had won. I pressed the button. I put the phone to my ear. The line didn't ring. It clicked once, a sharp, mechanical sound, and then there was silence. "Speak," a voice said. It wasn't a greeting, it was a command. The voice sounded like gravel churning in a cement mixer. It was deep, scarred, and utterly devoid of warmth. Silas, I whispered. My voice cracked. There was a pause on the other end. A long, heavy pause that stretched the silence until it felt like a physical weight. Diane, he said. He didn't ask how I had the number. He didn't ask why I was calling. He just said my name, and the sound of it made the hair on my arms stand up. I need you, I said, my voice gaining strength. I'm retired, Di, he rumbled. You know that, I'm dead. The file says I'm dead. Not today, I said. I took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of hospital antiseptic and my own drying seawater. It's Macy, I said. The silence on the line changed texture. It went from indifferent to attentive. Silas had only ever loved two things in this world, me and the niece he had bounced on his knee before he vanished. What happened? He asked. The tone was lower now, dangerous. Her husband, I said, spitting the word out like poison. Julian, he threw us overboard. I heard a sound on the other end. It sounded like wood snapping. A pencil, a chair leg, I didn't know. Explain, he said. We were 10 miles out, I said, speaking faster now, the adrenaline surging back. North Atlantic. He lured us out there. He threw Macy over the rail. She's pregnant, Silas, 7 months. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. He threw me in after her, I continued. He left us to drown. He watched us drift away and he turned off the lights. I waited for him to shout. I waited for him to swear, to scream, to promise murder. But there was nothing. The silence that came back down the line was more terrifying than the freezing ocean had been. It was the silence of a predator spotting prey. It was the silence of a bomb counting down the last second. Is she alive? Silas asked softly. Barely, I said. We're at St. Jude's. She's in surgery. The baby. They don't know yet. And the husband? He's got lawyers here already, I said, glancing down the hall where Marcus had disappeared. Trying to buy me off, trying to bury it. He thinks it was an accident. He thinks no one knows. He thinks he's safe, Silas said. It wasn't a question. He thinks I'm just a logistics manager, I said. He thinks Uncle Red is just a mechanic who fixes old cars in Arizona. Does he? Silas murmured. I could hear movement on his end now. The sound of heavy metal sliding against metal, the distinct rack of a slide. I need you to come home, Silas, I said. I can't fight them legally. They own the judges. They own the police, Julian's family. They are the law here. Laws are for people who want to live in a society, Diane, Silas said. I left society a long time ago. I want him destroyed, I said. I shocked myself with the violence of the words. I didn't just want justice. I wanted scorched earth. I don't want him in a jail cell, I hissed into the phone. I want him to feel what we felt. I want his world to dissolve. I want him to know that he touched the wrong family. You're asking me to do the thing I promised you I'd never do again, Silas said. I'm releasing you from the promise, I said. If I come back, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like tectonic plates shifting, I don't stop until there's nothing left standing. You understand that? No half measures, no settlements. Burn it all down, I said. Where is the yacht? He asked. Docked at the marina, I said. The Gilded Lady, berth 42. And Julian. Probably celebrating, I said bitterly. Tell the doctors to save my grandnephew, Silas said. Silas, I said, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. How long? I'm already moving, he said. It's a 6-hour flight from Arizona, I said. I'm not in Arizona, he replied. I was in the area checking on things. A chill went down my spine. He had been watching, always watching. Give me 20 minutes, he said. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm going to introduce Julian to the food chain, Silas said. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. My hands had stopped shaking. I stood up, pushing myself off the wall. I smoothed down my ruined, wet clothes. I walked back toward the waiting room, past the nurse's station, past the empty space where the lawyers had stood. I sat down in a hard plastic chair directly across from the operating room doors. I crossed my legs. I waited. Julian thought he was a shark because he had money. He thought he was a predator because he could hire men in suits to clean up his messes. He had no idea what a real predator looked like, but he was about to find out. My brother was coming, and he was bringing hell with him. I'm Diane, 54 years old, and while I've spent my life managing complex logistics for international freight, nothing prepared me for the logistics of saving my daughter from the man who swore to protect her. The waiting room at St. Jude's smelled like stale coffee and industrial bleach. It was a smell that tried to mask death but never quite succeeded. I sat in a hard plastic chair that dug into my spine. My linen trousers were finally dry, but they were stiff with salt, scratching my legs every time I shifted my weight. Every itch was a reminder of the freezing Atlantic water. Every shiver was a memory of Julian's face as he watched us drift away. I stared at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept around the face with agonizing slowness. Tick, tick, tick. It had been 3 hours since I made the call. 3 hours since the doctors told me Macy was out of surgery but critical. 3 hours of watching the rise and fall of her chest through the glass of the ICU window. Her face was a map of violence. Purple and yellow bruising bloomed across her cheekbone where she had hit the railing. Her lip was split and swollen. But it was the tubes that broke me. Tubes to breathe for her. Tubes to feed her. Tubes monitoring the tiny, struggling heartbeat of my unborn grandson in the incubator next to her. I felt small. I felt old. I felt like a woman who had brought a butter knife to a gunfight. Marcus Thorne and his legal team had vanished, presumably to draft up non-disclosure agreements they thought they could force me to sign. They thought they had won. They thought the silence in the hallway meant resignation. They didn't know the silence was the eye of the storm. Then the automatic doors at the far end of the corridor slid open. They didn't just open, they seemed to retreat. The air in the hallway changed instantly. It wasn't a temperature drop exactly. It was a pressure drop. The kind of atmospheric shift that happens right before a tornado touches down. I looked up. 2 armed hospital security guards were standing near the entrance, chatting about their weekend shifts. They stopped talking mid-sentence. They straightened up, their hands drifting instinctively toward the tasers on their belts. Then they took a step back. Silas walked through the doors. I hadn't seen my brother in 15 years, but my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't look like the mechanic I told people he was. He didn't look like the Uncle Red who sent generic birthday cards from a P.O. box in Arizona. He looked like a natural disaster wrapped in Italian wool. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him with lethal precision, tailored to hide the bulk of muscle that didn't belong on a man of his age. He walked with a gait that was terrifyingly smooth. No wasted movement. No sound. He moved like smoke. His hair was silver now, cropped short military style. His face was a landscape of scars and deep lines, carved from granite and left out in the desert sun. He didn't look at the security guards. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a command. The guards pressed themselves against the wall, their instincts screaming at them to let this predator pass. They lowered their eyes. Silas didn't scan the room. He knew exactly where I was. He walked straight toward me, his eyes locked on mine. They were the same steel gray eyes I remembered, but they were colder now, empty, like the barrel of a gun. I stood up, my legs trembling. Silas, I breathed. He didn't speak. He stopped 2 feet in front of me. He looked me over, his gaze taking in the salt stains on my clothes, the tangled mess of my hair, the exhaustion etched into my face. His jaw tightened. A small muscle feathered near his ear. That was the only sign of rage he allowed himself. He turned his head slowly toward the glass of the ICU. He looked at Macy. He looked at the bruises on her arms, the dark shadows under her eyes, the machinery keeping her alive. He placed one hand on the glass. His fingers were thick, calloused, capable of crushing stone. He pressed his palm against the surface, right over Macy's reflection. He stood there for a long minute just breathing. I saw his reflection in the glass. It was the face of a man who had left humanity behind a long time ago. He took a slow, deep breath, and I watched the suit jacket strain across his shoulders. He turned back to me. He reached out. His hand landed on my shoulder. It was heavy. It felt like an anchor. It felt like safety. "Diane," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the hum of the hospital machinery. "I'm sorry I'm late." "You're here," I whispered, tears finally spilling over. "You're here." "I saw the police report downstairs," he said quietly. "They listed it as a boating accident." "Julian paid them," I said, my voice shaking. "He owns the marina. He owns the cops." Silas nodded once. It was a sharp, definitive motion. He squeezed my shoulder. It wasn't a comforting squeeze, it was a transfer of energy. He was pouring his strength into me, steadying me, grounding me. "Accidents happen," Silas whispered. He leaned in closer. I could smell him. He didn't smell like travel. He didn't smell like cologne. He smelled like gun oil and rain. "But this wasn't an accident," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. "This was an act of war." He looked back at the glass, at Macy's broken form. "He hurt my blood," Silas said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "He thinks he's untouchable because he has a checkbook," Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "He thinks power comes from signatures." He looked at me again. "Where is he?" "The Yacht Club," I said, "hosting a gala tonight." Silas didn't blink. "Good," he said, "an audience." He released my shoulder and adjusted his cuffs. "Stay here with Macy," he commanded softly. "Do not leave this room. Do not speak to the police again until I call you." "Silas," I said, grabbing his sleeve. "What are you going to do?" He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back up to my face. For a split second, the coldness in his eyes cracked, and I saw the brother I used to know. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the shadow. "I'm going to teach Julian a lesson about the sea," Silas whispered. "What lesson?" I asked. He leaned down, his lips brushing my ear. "That the sharks aren't the only things hunting in the water." He pulled back. "By sunrise," he said, his voice flat and final, "Julian will wish he had drowned in that water with you." He turned on his heel. He walked away without looking back. I watched him go. The security guards were still pressed against the wall, watching him leave with wide, fearful eyes. They knew, even without knowing who he was, they knew. Death had just walked through the lobby. And it was heading for the marina. I'm Diane, 54 years old, and after decades of ensuring cargo ships navigate the treacherous currents of global trade, I was currently sitting in the passenger seat of a vehicle that felt more like a weapon than a car. It was midnight. The rain was hammering against the tinted windows of the black SUV. We were parked across the street from the gilded entrance of the Millennium Tower. That was where Julian lived. That was where he looked down on the city he thought he owned. Silas sat in the driver's seat. He wasn't holding a steering wheel. He was typing on a hardened laptop balanced on the center console. The interior of the SUV was bathed in the soft, clinical glow of 3 mounted monitors. "Watch," Silas said. His voice was calm. It was the voice of a man reading a weather report, not a man dismantling an empire. I looked at the center screen. It displayed a complex web of bank accounts. Cayman Islands, Zurich, Cyprus, Julian's safety nets, the places he hid the money he stole from his investors. The money he used to buy the silence of the local police who had dismissed my daughter's accident. He has $42 million in liquid assets accessible right now, Silas said. He tapped a single key. He corrected. I watched the numbers on the screen. They didn't just drop, they evaporated. It was digital hemorrhage. In 6 seconds, the balances across 12 different international accounts flashed red. Then they hit zero. My breath caught in my throat. Where did it go? I whispered. It's currently bouncing through a server farm in Estonia, Silas murmured, his eyes scanning a stream of code I couldn't understand. By morning, it will be donated anonymously to 3 different charities for victims of domestic abuse. I felt a cold, vicious thrill curl in my stomach. It was a sensation I had never felt before. It was the taste of vengeance. He's broke, I said. He's worse than broke, Silas replied. He's exposed. He pointed to the left monitor. It showed a file upload progress bar. It was 98% complete. What is that? I asked. The server of the United States Attorney for the Southern District, Silas said, and the personal inbox of the senior editor at the Times. The bar hit 100%. Upload complete, a computerized voice stated. Every bribe, Silas listed, his fingers flying across the keys. Every falsified manifest. The illegal dumping records from his shipping company, the payoffs to the zoning board. He looked at me, the blue light reflected in his steel gray eyes. I didn't just take his money, Diane, I took his mask. My hands were gripping the leather armrest. My daughter was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, because Julian thought he was above the law. Now the law was about to fall on him like a collapsing building. Is he in there? I asked, looking out the rain-streaked window at the penthouse balcony 50 stories up. He's there, Silas said. He left the gala early, probably to celebrate getting away with murder. Silas reached for a small, black switch on the dashboard. Let's ruin the mood. He flipped the switch. Instantly, high above us, the lights in the penthouse died. It wasn't a flicker, it was an amputation. The top floor of the building vanished into the black sky. What did you do? I gasped. I killed the grid for his unit, Silas said, and I disabled the backup generators. He's in the dark. I watched the building. A minute passed. Then the lobby doors burst open. I leaned forward. It was the staff, Julian's private security, his housekeepers. The personal assistants who sneered at me whenever I came to visit Macy. They were running. They were spilling out onto the wet pavement, clutching their phones, looking terrified. Why are they running? I asked. Because I sent a notification to their phones, Silas said. He turned the laptop screen toward me. It showed a text alert. Federal raid imminent. Accomplices will be prosecuted. Vacate immediately. They're rats, Silas said, no emotion in his voice. Rats know when the ship is sinking. They won't protect him, not for a paycheck that just bounced. I watched them scatter into the night. Julian was alone up there in the dark with no money, with the feds coming. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but it wasn't from sadness, it was relief. It's over, I whispered. You destroyed him. Silas closed the laptop. The click was loud in the quiet car. He turned to me. His face was shadowed, hard angles and scar tissue. He shook his head slowly. No, Diane, he said softly. He reached under his seat. I heard the heavy, metallic slide of steel against steel. He pulled out a tire iron. It was rusted, heavy, ugly. This, he said, gesturing to the dark building and the empty bank accounts. This was just the paperwork. He opened the driver's side door. The sound of the rain rushed into the car. The wind howled, smelling of wet asphalt and ozone. I haven't even touched him yet, Silas said, stepping out into the storm. He looked back at me through the open door. Raindrops clung to his silver hair. I just stripped the insulation, he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. Now I'm going to bring the lightning. He slammed the door. I watched him walk across the street. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked straight toward the glass doors of the lobby, the tire iron swinging loosely at his side. He walked like a man who owned the night. He walked like a legend coming out of retirement. I watched as he approached the locked glass doors. He didn't break stride. He swung the iron. The glass shattered. My brother stepped over the shards and disappeared into the darkness of the building. I sat back in the seat. My heart was pounding a rhythm against my ribs. Thump, thump, thump. Julian had thrown my daughter into the ocean. He had tried to drown my bloodline. I looked up at the darkened penthouse one last time. The systematic collapse was over. The violence was about to begin. I'm Diane, 54 years old, and while I spent my entire career managing the chaotic logistics of international shipping lanes, nothing in my life had prepared me for the coordinated demolition of a human being. The rain hadn't stopped. It was falling harder now, turning the world into a blur of gray and black. We knew he would come here. Silas had predicted it 3 moves ago. When the money vanished and the penthouse went dark, a man like Julian only has one instinct left: flight. We were parked at the edge of the private marina. The engine of the black SUV ticked as it cooled. "Stay close to me," Silas said. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the end of Pier 4. I looked through the rain-slicked windshield. I saw him, Julian. He was still wearing his tuxedo from the gala, but it was ruined. The expensive fabric was plastered to his skin. He was slipping and sliding on the wet wood of the dock, frantically trying to untie the mooring rope of a sleek white powerboat. It was his emergency exit, his last asset. He looked small. From the penthouse, he had looked like a giant. Here in the storm, he looked like a rat trapped in a bucket. "He's panicking," I whispered. "Panic makes men careless," Silas said. He opened the car door. I followed him out into the storm. The wind hit me like a physical blow, carrying the scent of brine and diesel fuel. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the crashing waves below the pier. We walked down the wooden planks. My boots thudded heavily. Silas moved silently. He moved like smoke. Julian was cursing, his fingers fumbling with the wet knot. Come on," he screamed at the rope. He didn't hear us approach. He didn't know he was already dead. Silas stopped 10 feet away from him. He just stood there. He looked like a statue carved from granite and regret. "Going somewhere, Julian?" Silas asked. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It cut through the wind and the rain like a razor blade. Julian spun around. His eyes went wide. He looked at Silas, then he looked at me. Recognition flickered in his face, followed immediately by terror. "Diane," he choked out. What are you doing here?" "Watching you drown," I said. My voice was steady. I surprised myself. I wasn't the crying mother in the hospital waiting room anymore. I was the storm. Julian stepped back, his heels hitting the edge of the dock. He looked trapped. His gaze darted between us and the boat. "You can't be here," Julian stammered, raising a shaking hand. "The police. I called the police." "The police are busy raiding your office," Silas said calmly. "And your accounts are empty. You don't have the money to pay them off anymore." Julian's face twisted. It was a mask of pure, ugly desperation. He reached into his tuxedo jacket. "No," I screamed. I saw the glint of metal, a gun. He had a gun. Time seemed to warp. I saw Julian raise the weapon, leveling it at my brother's chest. "Back off," Julian shrieked. I'll kill you, I'll kill both of you. My breath froze in my lungs. I expected Silas to duck. I expected him to run. But Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He moved. It happened faster than my eyes could process. 1 second, Silas was standing 10 feet away. The next, he was inside Julian's guard. It was a blur of motion, violent and precise. I heard a sickening crack. Julian screamed. The gun flew from his hand, spinning through the rain before splashing into the dark water below. Silas had Julian by the throat. He lifted him off his feet. He didn't struggle. He didn't strain. He lifted a grown man into the air with one hand as easily as if he were lifting a child. Silas slammed Julian down onto the edge of the pier. Julian gasped, his legs dangling over the side, over the black, churning water. The same water he had thrown Macy into. Silas leaned over him, his hand clamped around Julian's windpipe like a vice. "Look at it," Silas growled. He forced Julian's head down, forcing him to look at the dark waves crashing against the pilings. "It's cold, isn't it?" Silas whispered. "It's dark, it's lonely." Julian was clawing at Silas's wrist, his legs kicking uselessly at the air. "Please," Julian gargled. "Please don't, I'll give you anything." "You have nothing to give," Silas said. I walked forward. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to move. I walked until I was standing right over them. I looked down at Julian. His face was purple. Veins were bulging in his forehead. Tears were mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Diane," he wheezed, tell him to stop. He's crazy. He's a psychopath." I looked at my brother. Silas wasn't angry. He wasn't smiling. He was simply executing a task. He was the shadow. I looked back at Julian. "You threw my pregnant daughter off a yacht," I said. The words tasted like iron in my mouth. "It was an accident," Julian sobbed. "I didn't mean to. You left her to die," I said. "You went back to your party. You drank champagne while she swallowed salt water." Silas tightened his grip. Julian gagged. "Who is he?" Julian cried out, his voice a broken squeak. "Who is this guy?" "He's not just your brother. No businessman moves like that." The rain plastered my hair to my face. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was the calm of absolute clarity. I knelt down on the wet wood. I got close to Julian's face. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the mother of the woman he tried to kill. "You're right, Julian," I said softly. I looked deep into his terrified, weeping eyes. "You made a mistake," I said. "You ran a background check on me. You saw a single mother. You saw a logistics manager. You thought we were weak." I gestured to Silas, who was holding Julian over the abyss with the indifference of a god. "You didn't check him," I whispered. "Please," Julian begged. "My brother isn't a businessman," I said, letting the words hang in the cold air between us. I stood up, towering over him. "He's a reckoning. I'm Diane, 54 years old, and after 30 years of managing high-stakes logistics for global shipping conglomerates, I was currently overseeing the final delivery of justice on a rain-slicked pier. The wind howled around us, tearing at my coat. Silas still had Julian by the throat. Julian's feet were barely touching the wet wood. He was sobbing, a broken, wet sound that was swallowed by the storm. "Please," Julian choked out, his hands clawing uselessly at Silas's forearm. "I'll pay you. I have offshore accounts. I have millions." Silas didn't blink. He didn't even look tempted. He pulled Julian closer until their faces were inches apart. The rain dripped from Silas's nose onto Julian's cheek. "Money is for people who have a future," Silas said softly. "You don't have one." Then Silas leaned in. He moved with the slow, deliberate intimacy of a predator playing with its food. He brought his lips right next to Julian's ear. I was standing close enough to hear the intake of breath, but I couldn't hear the words at first. Silas whispered something. It was a string of numbers and a single guttural word. Task Force Black, Designation Wraith 19. I didn't know what it meant. To me, it sounded like gibberish. To Julian, it sounded like the gates of hell slamming shut. I watched Julian's eyes go wide. The pupils dilated until his eyes were black holes of pure terror. His jaw went slack. He stopped struggling. He stopped breathing. He stared at my brother not as a man, but as a myth he had heard rumors of in dark corners of the world he pretended to understand. Then I saw it. A dark stain began to spread across the front of Julian's ruined tuxedo trousers. It mixed with the rain dripping down his leg. The smell of hot urine hit me sharp and pungent even through the salt air and diesel fumes. He had lost control. His bladder had failed. "Oh God," Julian whimpered, his voice barely a breath. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." He knew. He finally understood that he hadn't just angered a protective uncle. He had declared war on a ghost. Suddenly the world exploded in blue and red light. Sirens wailed, cutting through the sound of the ocean. Tires screeched on the asphalt of the marina parking lot above us. "Police, drop it, hands in the air." Voices amplified by bullhorns echoed off the water. Silas didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply opened his hand. Julian dropped to the dock like a sack of wet cement. He curled into a ball, shaking violently, lying in his own filth. Silas turned slowly to face the ramp. A dozen officers were rushing down the wooden planks, guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the rain. I felt a spike of fear in my chest. "Silas," I whispered. He touched my arm. "Stay calm, Diane," he said. "The paperwork is done." He raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing he was unarmed. He looked bored. A detective in a trench coat pushed through the line of uniformed officers. He had a gun pointed at Silas's chest. "Step away from him," the detective shouted. Silas took a respectful step back. "He's all yours, detective," Silas said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Get on the ground," an officer screamed at Silas. Silas didn't get on the ground. He reached into his jacket pocket. "Gun," someone yelled. "Easy," Silas said, his movement slow and telegraphed. "Just evidence." He pulled out a small, silver flash drive. He held it out to the detective. The rain glistened on the metal casing. "What is this?" the detective barked, lowering his weapon slightly but keeping it trained on Silas. "High-definition thermal imaging," Silas said, "taken from a low-orbit surveillance satellite that officially doesn't exist." The detective frowned. "What? It covers this sector," Silas continued, sounding like he was giving a boardroom presentation. "Time-stamped for last Tuesday night. You'll see 2 heat signatures on the deck of the Lady Jane. You'll see the larger signature, him." Silas pointed a finger at the shivering heap that was Julian. "Force the smaller signature, Macy, over the railing." I stared at the drive. I looked at my brother. He had access to satellites. He had watched it happen. No, he had found the footage. He had called in favors that I couldn't even imagine. The detective took the drive, looking confused and wary. "We'll verify this," the detective grunted. "You do that," Silas said. "It shows intent, it shows premeditation, it shows attempted murder." 2 officers hauled Julian to his feet. He was limp. He couldn't stand on his own. The expensive Italian leather of his shoes scraped against the wood. "Cuff him," the detective ordered. I watched the metal cuffs click around Julian's wrists. Click, click. The sound was music. It was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Julian looked up as the cold steel bit into his skin. He looked at the police officers. He looked at the guns. He looked at the handcuffs. And then he looked at Silas. Silas was standing there, hands in his pockets now, the wind whipping his silver hair. He was staring at Julian with eyes that promised nothing but eternal suffering. A strange expression crossed Julian's face. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even sadness. It was relief, pure, unadulterated relief. Julian leaned into the police officer holding him. "Take me," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "Please take me away, put me in a cell, put me in solitary, just get me away from him." He realized it. He knew. Prison was a cage, but it was also a fortress. Inside a concrete box, he was safe from the man who could pull satellite footage out of thin air and crush windpipes with one hand. Out here in the open world, he was prey. "Get him out of here," the detective said, disgusted by the smell coming off Julian. They dragged him up the ramp. Julian didn't look back at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the flashing lights of the cruiser, running toward them like they were a sanctuary. I stood alone with Silas on the dock. The rain was soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, but I felt a fire burning in my chest. I watched my son-in-law, the golden boy of real estate, the man who thought he could discard my daughter like trash, being shoved into the back of a police car. He was broken. He was humiliated. He was erased. I turned to Silas. "You really have satellite footage?" I asked, my voice shaking. Silas watched the police car drive away, the red tail lights fading into the storm. He didn't smile. "I have everything, Diane," he said quietly. "I told you I handle the things that can't be handled." He offered me his arm. "Come on," he said. "Macy is waiting. Let's go tell her the monster is gone." I took his arm. It felt like holding onto a steel beam. We walked up the ramp, leaving the wet dock and the memory of Julian's fear behind us. The nightmare was over. But as I looked at my brother's profile in the gloom, I realized something else. My life as a simple logistics manager was over too. I had seen behind the curtain. I had seen what my brother truly was. And I knew deep down that you can't unsee a legend. I'm Diane, 55 years old, and holding my healthy grandson was the only promotion I ever really wanted. The garden smelled of jasmine and expensive champagne, a stark contrast to the diesel and salt spray that had filled my nose 6 months ago. I adjusted the blanket around the sleeping infant in my arms. His name was Leo. He was heavy, warm, and perfect. He had Macy's nose and, thank God, absolutely nothing of his father. I looked out across the manicured lawn of the estate we had just purchased. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. 100 guests were mingling near the white tent, holding crystal flutes, their laughter tinkling like wind chimes. They were donors, politicians, and local celebrities. They were all looking at the stage. They were looking at Macy. My daughter stood behind the podium, the afternoon sun catching the gold highlights in her hair. She wasn't the terrified girl shivering in the dark waters of the Atlantic anymore. She wasn't the victim gasping for air while her husband watched her drown. She was a force of nature. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed power. She gripped the sides of the podium with hands that no longer trembled. "The Thorn Foundation isn't just about charity," Macy's voice rang out, clear and amplified by the speakers. "It is about reclamation." I felt a fierce swell of pride in my chest. It tightened my throat. I looked down at Leo, sleeping soundly against my shoulder, oblivious to the fact that his mother was commanding a room of wolves. We had destroyed Julian. It hadn't been enough to put him in prison. Silas had insisted on total annihilation. While Julian sat in a holding cell awaiting trial for attempted murder, Silas's team of forensic accountants had descended on Julian's empire like a plague of locusts. They found every offshore account. They found every tax loop. They found every dirty deal. And then they handed it all over to the authorities. The government seized everything. But Silas, being Silas, had maneuvered the assets. Through a series of shell companies and legal loopholes that I didn't even try to understand, A significant portion of the liquidated assets had been funneled back into a restitution fund for Macy. We took his money. We took his reputation. We took the yacht he had thrown her off of, sold it for scrap, and used the proceeds to build this foundation for victims of domestic violence. Macy was literally building her new life on the ashes of his destruction. "We will be a light for those who have been forced into the dark," Macy said, her voice breaking slightly before hardening again. The crowd erupted in applause. I clapped with one hand, patting Leo's back with the other, but my eyes didn't stay on Macy. I scanned the perimeter of the garden. It was a habit I couldn't break. I looked past the catering staff. I looked past the high stone walls. I looked toward the line of ancient oak trees that bordered the property. There he was, Silas. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a dark gray suit cut to conceal the weapon I knew was holstered beneath his left arm. He was standing perfectly still, his back against the rough bark of a tree hidden in the dappled shadows. He wasn't watching Macy. He was watching the gate. He was watching the waiters. He was watching the horizon. I navigated through the crowd, excusing myself as people tried to coo over the baby. I needed to speak to him. I walked across the grass, the sound of the party fading slightly as I approached the tree line. Silas didn't move as I approached. He didn't take off his sunglasses. "He's asleep," Silas said softly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. "He had a big lunch," I said. I stood next to my brother, looking back at the party. From here, the celebration looked like a painting. Bright, happy, safe. "You should go up there," I said. "Macy wants to thank you publicly." Silas shook his head. A barely perceptible movement. "No," he said. "She owes you her life, Silas," I said. "We both do." "She doesn't owe me anything," Silas replied. "Family doesn't keep a ledger." He turned his head slightly, looking at the baby. For a second, the hard lines of his face softened. He reached out a scarred hand and brushed his knuckle against Leo's soft cheek. The contrast was jarring. The hand that had held a man over an abyss, the hand that had ended lives in deserts and jungles, was now touching my grandson with the gentleness of a feather. "He's clear," Silas said. "The threat assessment is 0. Julian is in solitary confinement. He won't last a year. The other inmates know what he did." I shuddered. I knew Silas had ensured that too. "And his associates?" I asked. "Handled," Silas said, one word. It carried the weight of a dozen unseen operations. "Are you staying?" I asked, feeling a sudden pang of desperation. I didn't want him to leave. I had spent my whole life thinking my brother was the black sheep, the drifter, the failure. Now I realized he was the steel beam holding up the sky. "I can't stay, Diane," Silas said. He pulled his hand back. He adjusted his cuffs. "Why not?" I asked. "Because that," he nodded toward the bright, happy party, "is your world. It's a world of rules and laws and sunshine." He looked at me, and even through the sunglasses, I could feel the intensity of his gaze. "I don't belong in the light, Diane," he said. "I keep the monsters away so you can live in it. If I stay, I bring the shadows with me." My heart broke a little. He was sentencing himself to a life of ghosts so we could have a life of peace. "Will I see you?" I asked. "I'm always watching," he said. "Always." He stepped back. He seemed to blend into the tree trunk. "Take care of the boy," he whispered. "I will," I promised. I blinked, wiping a sudden tear from my eye. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of leaves, just an empty space where a legend had stood. I looked back at the party. Macy was stepping down from the stage, smiling, surrounded by people who admired her strength. I looked down at Leo, who let out a soft sigh in his sleep. I held him tighter. I realized then that there are two types of power in this world. There is the power of money, of foundations, of brick and mortar, the empire I had helped build. And then there is the power of the brother who walks in the dark. I kissed my grandson's forehead. We were safe, not because of the walls, not because of the money, but because the monsters were afraid of the man who called himself my brother. I walked back into the light, ready to live the life he had given us.